Okay, we'd like to turn to Genesis chapter 45. Very familiar passage of Scripture. Genesis chapter 45. We'll read the first 5 verses. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him. And he cried, Cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near. And he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. Coming to Genesis 45, we have the climax of the story of Joseph's life, which began back in chapter 37. What is recorded here in Genesis 45 really is one of the most beautiful scenes in all the Old Testament, all the Bible. It's a magnificent portrayal of the grace of God. How He came to our rescue in the person of His Son, Jesus Christ. It is a picture of power. It's a picture of grace. It is a picture of mercy. It's a picture of kindness. A picture of reconciliation. Now, as we all know, Joseph is a type of Christ, I believe, the most complete type of Christ in all the Word of God. Both were beloved of their father. Both were hated by their brethren. Both were rejected. Both were plotted against. Both were mistreated. Both were delivered to die. Both were delivered from the pit of death, and both were exalted by God. Now in our text, Joseph's brothers, which are a picture of ourselves, they're standing before Joseph. And they are in great need. And they're guilty. And they're ignorant of the person of Joseph. We read in verse 1 that Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. Had he not done so, they would have never known who he was. So there they are, standing before Joseph, and Joseph makes himself known unto them. And everything in this chapter centers upon this fact, that Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. Everything comes back to that statement. The way that he did this, we hear him twice say, verse 3 and verse 4, I am Joseph. I am Joseph. It was a private, it was a passionate, it was a powerful revelation of himself. I am Joseph. And what we read here is a beautiful picture of salvation and the salvation life that follows. Because what follows salvation should always be the salvation life. So we want to speak this morning on salvation and the salvation life illustrated in Joseph. First of all, let's consider the brothers of Joseph. Again, they are a picture of ourselves in our unsafe condition. Back in Genesis 37, Joseph's brothers hated him. We read in Genesis 37:4, they hated him. It's a simple fact. They hated him. And because of the deep-seatedness of their hatred, we also read in verse 4 of Genesis 37, and could not. And could not. They could not speak peaceably unto him. Because of their hatred, they could not. Their hatred disabled them. Their view of Joseph disabled them. We too were disabled by our condition. In verse 8, it says in Genesis 37, they hated him yet the more. In other words, it was an intensifying hatred. It was growing. And one of the reasons they hated him was because of his message. It says there, they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. They hated him, and the more they heard his message, the more intense their hatred became. What was his message? It was a message of exaltation, that he would be exalted above them. They couldn't bear the thought of that. So it is today. It was an irritation to them. The message of an exalted Joseph irritated them. And so it is today. The exaltation of Christ is an irritation to lost man. In verse 18 of Genesis 37, we read that they conspired or they schemed. And then notice the next two words, against him. They are against him. The whole world is anti-Christ. The spirit of the world is against Christ. So it was in our unsafe condition. We were against Christ. They conspired against him to slay him. That speaks of the degree of their hatred. Speaks of the degree of their disdain that they had toward him. They wanted to slay him. And if Christ were walk this earth today, the cry would still be the same. Crucify him. Crucify him. Verse 20 of Genesis 37. Notice that their hatred and ridicule and unbelief of his message. They say, we shall see what will become of his dreams. That shows that's in a tone of ridicule. It's in a tone of unbelief. And we read in verse 23 of Genesis 37, Joseph was come unto his brethren, not to do them any harm. And what did they do? They stripped him out of his coat. They hated that robe. They hated that robe of many colors. Why? Because it represented his honor. It represented his father's love for Joseph. They robbed him When they stripped that coat from him, they robbed him of his honor. And as they did so, it's as if they're saying, you're no better than us. That's still the spirit and the attitude of the world. Verse 24 of Genesis 37, it says, they took him and cast him into a pit. And in verse 25, we read that they sat down to eat bread. They cast him into a pit, and then they sat down and had lunch. No sense of shame. No sense of guilt whatsoever. And they ignored the pleas of Joseph. In Genesis 37:26, we hear them say, what profit is it if we slay our brother? What are they interested in? Their own profit. Shows their selfishness. It was their own profit at the expense of Joseph. There's still those who profess to be saved. That's their entire life. It's all about them at the expense of Jesus Christ. They would go on and sell their brother into slavery and live the next 22 years, for the most part, unmindful of Joseph. They would go the next 22 years living a lie. Living a lie. So now let's look at these brothers before Joseph. They're standing before him. Back in Genesis 41, we're told of a worldwide famine. And in Genesis 41:55, the land of Egypt was famished. So it was a famine that resulted, of course, in hunger and even starvation. Verse 56 of Genesis 41, and the famine was over all the face of the earth, not just in Egypt. And Joseph, he's exalted now, opened all the storehouses, and the famine waxed sore. That is, it was a severe famine, caused great pain, caused great agony. Verse 57 we read, and all countries came into Egypt to Joseph to buy corn. Why? Because the famine was so sore, so painful, so agonizing, so excruciating. And this was so again in all the lands. Chapter 42, Jacob, upon hearing that there was corn in Egypt, sends 10 of his sons. Benjamin is held back. He sends them to Egypt to buy corn. Joseph had what his brothers needed. They had what his brothers could not do without. That's still so today. Jesus Christ has what every sinner needs, what they can't do without. So these brothers arrive in Egypt, and they appear before Joseph. But they're so blind, they don't know who Joseph is. All they're interested in is what they can get. So here are those who are guilty of terrible things, living in famine, in danger of perishing. And Joseph has what they need. They would receive from him, again, they have no idea that it's Joseph. They would return home, living their lives, consuming what they had received. We see all of that in Genesis 42. It is a picture of a sinful and guilty people going on with their lives, just consuming the blessings of the Lord, oblivious to who gave it to them, just living a sin-filled life. Jacob again sends his sons back to Egypt to obtain more. And that brings us to Genesis chapter 45. And from verse 6, at this time, the famine had been going on for 2 years. So they're before Joseph again. The famine has been going on for 2 years. And there they are. Guilty of sin before the one in whom they stand. Completely blind and ignorant of whom they are standing before. And though they are in desperate need, they're really unaware of what they really need. All they see is they need bread and corn. But they needed more than that. And they're seeking. But what are they seeking? They're seeking temporary relief. That's what the lost sinner does. They seek temporary relief. And in verse 2, Joseph, he knows who they are. He knew who they were the first time. He weeps aloud. Why? Because of what they had done to him? No. He weeps for the love that he had for them. He sees them there in their pitiful state, and he weeps because he loved them. And it was a love in spite of themselves. It was a love in spite of what they had done to Joseph. And then come these words, verse 3. I am Joseph. I am Joseph. Just so there wouldn't be any doubt, doth my father yet live? I am Joseph. And then we read, and his brethren could not answer him. The reason is because they were troubled. I imagine so. They were troubled at his presence. And there they stand, absolutely stunned. I am Joseph. They're speechless. They're terrified. They're guilty of crimes against him. And they know that now. I am Joseph. They're guilty. And they deserve death at his hands. Remember how troubled you were when you first came to the knowledge that you were guilty and that you deserved eternal condemnation at his hands. And then he says, come near to me. Come near to me. I am Joseph. Come near to me. Again, they're guilty of terrible crimes against him. They don't know what Joseph is going to do unto them when they come near. And we read, and they came near. Why? Because of the power of those words. I am Joseph. And they came near. And I believe they came trembling. Because they don't know. What's he going to do? We are guilty. And we are deserving of wrath at his hands. What is he going to do? So they came near. And he speaks to them directly. He says, I am Joseph, your brother. Your brother. He could have just said, I am Joseph. They knew he was his brother, their brother. But he specifically says, I am Joseph, your brother. This is to magnify their sin. I am the one that you should have loved. I'm your brother. The one you should have loved. More importantly, the one who loves you. I am Joseph, your brother. Oh, read those words over and over. Your brother. Because I imagine they stuck, it was a sword going into their heart. Your brother. Your brother. And then notice what he said. Whom ye sold into Egypt. He confronts them with their sin. He brings them face to face with their sins. I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. So now their minds would go back to that day. That day that they sold him. That's where their minds would automatically go. Remember what they did to him that day? They stripped him of his coat. I believe they would begin to remember that. Remember what their intent was? Their intent was to kill him. And were it not for Reuben, they would have. Remember what they did? They cast him into a pit. All of this is becoming very fresh upon their minds. And they ignored his pleas. And they sold him. So imagine the emotions that welled up in his brothers when he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. All the guilt of what they had done. All of it is brought before them in a very clear way. They can see it as if it was happening all over again. Remember that day when the Lord made your sins clear. Not one of those brothers could stand there and deny what he was saying. It was true. I am Joseph. I am your brother, and you sold me into Egypt. Oh, if we could see their individual faces, I believe you'd see shock. More importantly, you would see shame. And you would see guilt. But then, notice verse 5 through 7. Now therefore, I'm Joseph, I'm your brother, you sold me into Egypt. Be not grieved, Obviously, they were grieved, nor angry with yourselves. They were so ashamed that ye sold me hither. Mentions it again. You sold me. You sold me. For God did send me before you to preserve life. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm Joseph, the one you sold in Egypt. But God has sent me to preserve. Verse 7 or verse 6. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. He says 2 years have passed, but there's 5 more. And God sent me before you to preserve you. You sold me, but God has sent me to preserve you. So they're brought face to face with their sin. Now they're brought face to face with mercy and grace. To preserve you a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. What he was telling his brothers right then, I am Joseph, I'm your brother, you sold me, you're guilty, but I forgive you. But I forgive you. And I'm going to preserve your life. So though they were guilty, they were forgiven. Though they were deserving of Joseph's wrath, they are set free. Joseph could have kept his brothers in the dark, but he didn't. He did not have to reveal his identity to them. He had every right to judge them. He had every right to make them pay for what they had done. And he had every right to turn them away and give them nothing. But instead of judgment, there was grace. And instead of condemnation, there was deliverance. And instead of being turned away, there was reconciliation. And there was a reunion between them and Joseph. Go back to that day when you stood before him in your sins. And you were made to feel the reality of those sins. You were made to feel the weight of your crimes against him. And then you heard those words, the sweetest words that we've ever heard. I am Jesus, and I forgive you. I am Jesus, and all your crimes against me, they're all taken away. They're no longer in sight. No longer are they placed to your account. They're erased. They're cleansed. They're removed. I am Joseph. These are words of love, grace, and mercy. They're miraculous words. They're amazing, momentous words, life-changing words. Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And they would have never known Joseph had he not revealed himself. You and I would have never known Jesus Christ had he not revealed himself to us. It was a private revelation. Remember, he sent everyone else out of the room. It was a private, it was a personal revelation. And you and I that are saved, there was a time when Jesus Christ personally revealed Himself to us. It was a very plain revelation. I am Joseph, your brother. It was very plain. There was absolutely no doubt in their minds that it was him. Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, and it was a powerful revelation. They go back to their father in verse 27. And it says, they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said unto them. Had an impact upon them. It was powerful. So let's look briefly at the life that follows this. In verse 9, he says, haste ye, and go up to my father, and say unto him, thus saith thy son Joseph. Verse 13, and ye shall tell my father. So he gives them instruction. He saves them, if you will. And then he instructs them what they are to do. The Lord saved our souls. He's given us instruction. In other words, our lives are not to be lived as we please. And their lives were not their own, to live as they please. Joseph told them what they were to do. They have instruction from the one in whom they had forgiveness. And so you and I. Our life is no longer to be aimless. We have instruction from the one who set us free. Notice the spirit in which they were to carry this out. He says there in verse 9, haste ye. Do not delay. Do not hesitate in what I tell you. You do it. You be ready and you be willing. And it all goes back to, I am Joseph. I am Joseph. It was a life of mission and purpose. He said, go up to my father. This was their responsibility. The Lord saved our souls. And now we have a responsibility to Joseph. It was a life with a message. Notice also concerning this mission, say unto him, thus saith thy son Joseph. They were given a message. And what was the message about? It was about Joseph. Thus saith thy son Joseph. We have a message. And the message is about Jesus Christ. Many who are saved have forgotten the message. And their message is now one of politics or whatever. That's not the message. The message is Joseph, Jesus. But notice the details of this message. God hath made me Lord of all Egypt. It is a message of exaltation in lordship. Our life is now to center around the message That message is Jesus Christ is exalted on high and He's Lord of all. That's the message. Oh, people are going to get mad at that. Yes, they will. They always have. It's not going to change. Notice also verse 13, and ye shall tell my Father of all my glory. The Lord has saved us. He's given us instruction. He's given us a message about Himself. And it is our responsibility to speak of all of His glory. That's our message. The message is Joseph. But notice also, they're to tell their father, come down unto me. It was a message of invitation. We have a message for sinners. The message is Jesus. And the message is one of invitation. Come. But notice also it was a message of urgency. Come down unto me, tarry not. This is what they were to tell their father. You come. And you come now. That's our message. An urgent message concerning Joseph. But it was also a life of privilege. In verse 10, he told them, thou shalt be near unto me. 22 years they've been separated from Joseph. And now he says, you'll be near unto me. What a privilege. What a privilege we have to live our lives near unto Him. This is all being spoken to Jacob. Jacob was to bring his sons back into Egypt to Joseph. And there they would have a life of promise. He says in verse 11, I will nourish, I will maintain and support you. Yes, you sold me into Egypt, but I will nourish you. That's been our life ever since that day. I am Joseph. It's been a life of nourishment. And then notice what he says, I will nourish you, for there are yet 5 years of famine. He is saying, there are more difficult days to come, but you'll spend them with me. And you'll experience them through me. Big difference. Our difficulties did not end at salvation. But what changed is now we can spend those difficulties with Him and live through them. It was a life of fellowship. Verse 14 and 15. And he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. And after this, his brethren talked with him. That's been our privilege ever since. Ever since that day of revelation, that's been our privilege. To talk with Him. It's a life of abundant provision. Verse 21 and 22. And the children of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons, according to the commandment of Pharaoh, and gave them provision for the way. That's been happening ever since. To all them he gave each man changes of raiment, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of raiment. It's a life of abundant provision. But it's also a life of warning. Verse 24, he sent his brethren away, and they departed. And he said unto them, see that ye fall not out by the way. So there they are, overflowing with joy. They have this sense of release. They've been released from their guilt. They've been released from their sin. They have relief. They have peace. And Joseph says unto them, see that ye fall not out by the way. Joseph knew the fickleness and the sinful tendencies of his brothers. And the Lord knows all about our fickleness and our sinful tendencies. And Joseph knew that they had sins, and that they had weaknesses, and they had failures, and they had faults. And he knew that on the way back, a lot could happen. So he gives this warning. See, take heed, be on guard, that you do not fall out along the way. The way had difficulties. The way had temptations and circumstances. And he knew it would just take one incident and just one of his brothers to get out of sorts. For just one of his brothers to get in the flesh. And they would forget the instruction. That's where we are today. Many have forgotten. Many who have been saved. Many who have had this experience. I am Joseph. Since that day, they've fallen out along the way. And they have forgotten their mission. They've become distracted. Joseph warned against this. And the Lord warns us. See that you fall not out by the way. Collectively and individually. The danger is that they would lose the joy of what they just experienced. And they would go backwards. And such is still true today. Now, I believe the warning is twofold. It is a warning not to fall out among themselves. You get amongst a group of saved people that have fallen out among themselves, they don't get much accomplished because they have forgotten why they're here. And I believe it's also a warning not to fall away from the experience that they just had. And I'm afraid many have fallen away from that as well. They have forgotten all about the salvation experience. So these brothers, just like you and I, were in danger of a spiritual regression. That danger is always real. See, take heed that we do not regress spiritually. That's the warning to each one of us. And how many times God has stirred and moved our hearts and refreshed us and revived us, filling us with zeal and joy and assurance and peace, only to fall out by the way. There are people sit in church, the Lord blesses, the Lord stirs them, and on the way home, they fall out by the way. Get in an argument with their wife, get in an argument with the children, and they fall out. It doesn't take us long. It doesn't take much for you and I to fall out by the way. Just a little thing. Someone else could fall out by the way which leads to us falling out, by the way. We're still responsible. So how many times it has happened in the lives of God's people? They're on a spiritual high. But then something happens. Somebody says something. Somebody doesn't say something. And here you go. Spiritual regression. The truth is this, it's sad, but it's true. God has blessed us. We'll get over it. That's the truth. Oh, I'm just rejoicing. God has blessed. You'll get over it. You'll get over it. And what we don't get over, so-and-so said such and such. And you never get over that. We're a needy people. See that you fall not out. By the way, what a wonderful life we can live. And it all goes back to that day when Jesus said to us, I am Jesus. And you're forgiven. What a wonderful life we've had the privilege of living. Brother Ben, if you come and lead us in verse of song.